Hello, Internet. Um, so I've seen a lot of initial criticism of the Shadows of the Erdtree expansion for Elden Ring, and I thought it would be fun for me to make a video kind of defending it. Not because I think it's perfect. I mean, if you didn't like Shadow of the Erdtree, it's totally fair to criticize it. It's not perfect, obviously, but I saw a lot of reviews after I finished Shadow of the Erdtree where a lot of people seem to be pretty disappointed by it. And I started thinking about responses to that. And that kind of led me into a broader mind space thinking about Elden Ring as a whole and From Software games as a whole. So I just thought it'd be fun to maybe explore some of those thoughts. Let's just to give you a bit of my background, which I don't know if you care, but it might give some helpful context for how I think about things. I am a board game designer. I'm working on publishing my first project on Kickstarter soon, but I've been designing board games casually for a long time, and it's made me think about things like video games in a different way because in board games, something that you really have to zero in on is like what's the core experience, because you don't have a computer to do a lot of the work for you. Since you're relying on people to do a lot of the quote-unquote computing work, you need the game to be as streamlined and kind of zeroed in on the experience as possible, which has kind of informed how I think about video games as well. Yeah, one more thing. I have been a long time Souls series fan. I've played every Souls game, including Demon Souls, the original, not the remake. That and I honestly thought it was not great, but I still enjoyed myself. But I've put more than 100 hours, I think, into most of the Souls games. I love the Dark Souls series. I love Sekiro. I really enjoyed Bloodborne, even though I didn't love it. I really enjoyed Elden Ring. I actually loved Elden Ring, though I think it has some things that it forgot from Dark Souls that I might bring up. But also for context, I'm not like one of the diehard like 100% completionist people. I have not 100%ed Shadow of the Erdtree by any means, or base game Elden Ring. I don't bother. I don't bother like going through and like doing every single quest every time. I mainly just enjoy exploring and having fun and immersing myself in the story, all that good stuff. So I would say I'm probably in the top like 3% of players who kind of devote time to the game, but I'm definitely not in like that one like 0.1% of like ultra hardcore players. So yeah, these are not really expert opinions, I guess, but more like serious fan opinions, and also like fellow game designer opinions that I think add some extra perspective to Elden Ring. Okay, so let's talk about common critiques of Shadows of the Erdtree. So what I like to do after I play a game is I usually like to read other people's reviews, and I stumbled across where is it? This guy, Curse You Bale. Curse You Bale wrote a really great review, I think, and a lot of their points I would agree with. But a lot of these points were brought up from the stance of like, oh, I wish that these were my problems with base game Elden Ring, and the DLC disappointed me because it didn't fix these problems. And if you, I think they literally say right here, if you simply want 40 hours of more Elden Ring, then I would genuinely recommend this for you. But if you're expecting it to be particularly better than the base game, then I would probably skip this or wait for a discount. There is a lot to discuss. This is well said, and I think it kind of matches a lot of the other criticism that I've seen Shadow of the Erdtree receive. But I generally disagree with the way this is phrased, and I think it reveals a way of looking at DLC and what DLC are that is just not realistic. Because what is a DLC? When you're buying a DLC, you're expecting to get more content for the same game, right? And if you're expecting that content to be significantly different in quality or style than the base game, I think what you're expecting is a completely different game. So saying that it's just 40 more hours of Elden Ring, I don't think is quite fair, because that's what you sign up for when you buy a DLC, right? You're expecting just more content for the same game. Curse You Bale brings up a lot of points about the problems with the DLC that I think a lot of other people share. And here's some of the most common critiques that I've seen. The area was too big. A lot of people seem to feel that you would just ride around on your horse and not get much interesting stuff for it. Like there's a few important landmarks to visit, but then most of the time you're just running through empty fields. Another common complaint, there was a lot of useless items. Curse You Bale actually says this really well. Also, while there are certainly a few noteworthy things you can find here, there are also a ton of completely mediocre upgrade materials that will make you feel like you wasted your time, with tons of player messages aptly saying dung. Why even bother? This is well said and very true. If you've played the DLC, which I'm assuming you have, you know that there are a lot of player messages that just say dung next to really bad items that you can find. Another critique, boring dungeons. A lot of people seem to feel that the dungeons didn't have very interesting bosses or enemies or whatever in them. People just seem to not like the boss fights. A lot of the critiques I saw about the boss fights are that they're hard to follow because the boss hits so fast and so hard that your only option really is to just tank your way through most of the hits and try to get a poke in every once in a while. And spoilers, obviously, the final boss for Shadow of the Erdtree is Radahn, and a lot of people complained that there were so many visual effects happening in this fight that it was hard to follow the fight itself, which, fair, that there was a lot going on. And finally, the lackluster ending. I mean, after you kill Radahn, you get like a 20-second cutscene, basically, and that's it. That's Shadow of the Erdtree. So these critiques, the reason I'm bringing these all up is not because I think they're wrong. Actually, I agree with all of these critiques. However, the point I want to make is that these were all problems with base game Elden Ring as well. And it seems like people don't really remember that. Either they don't remember that the base game Elden Ring had a lot of empty space in the map, they don't remember that it had a lot of useless items, or that the dungeons were boring, that some of the boss fights were not so good, and that the ending had like, I don't know, like a 40-second cutscene, like maybe a minute, I don't even remember, but after that whole game, there was like a very short cutscene and then roll credits. So I think people are either just not remembering that these were all part of base game Elden Ring, or they were expecting the DLC to be better than the base game, which I think is generally unfair. Because if you're buying a DLC, like I said, if you're buying a DLC, you're signing up for more of the same game, right? You're not saying that you want a different game. You're saying that you want more of, Elden Ring or whatever it is. That's what you're telling the publisher, at least. That may not be what you want to hear, but at least from Software's perspective and Miyazaki's perspective, that's what a DLC is about. And that's the market for a DLC. It's people who just want more of the base game. They don't expect that the players want these things to be very different, because if it's too different, then it's just a different game. It's not actually an expansion. I guess the first part of this video, to sum up, is just me arguing that the DLC does what it sets out to do, which is just expand Elden Ring with all of its good and bad stuff. And I think that's a success. And I want to take a moment here to just argue for why the DLC is honestly quite good in its own right. The area did feel big, but I enjoyed exploring enough and just seeing the beautiful set pieces and enjoying the music and the atmosphere that I really didn't mind having sparser areas. I didn't need it to be super dense, because sometimes I just wanted to step back and enjoy the scenery. Useless items. I did feel like there were a lot of useless items in Shadow of the Erdtree. There were several moments where I felt like leaving a dung message. However, I did feel like there was generally a higher ratio of interesting to uninteresting items when I got a weapon, I generally thought it was. I more often thought it was a cooler weapon. When I got armor, I more often thought it was cool looking. When I got a consumable item, well, the consumable items in Elden Ring, just whether you're talking about the base game or the expansion, the consumable items are generally pretty uninspiring. But I did appreciate how a lot of the items, the consumables in Shadow of the Erdtree were, I think, just generally a bit more interesting than base game Elden Ring ones. The dungeons in the expansion were actually more interesting, in my opinion, than the dungeons in Elden Ring. Actually, this is something I have a very strong opinion about that I didn't see a lot of other people sharing. The dungeons in base game Elden Ring, I found, were almost painfully tedious. Like, almost as bad as the Chalice dungeons if you played Bloodborne. I mean, it was just obviously copy-paste, like, dungeon pieces. It had the same enemies in each one, the same, music and, like, ambience. And it was just dry and gloomy, and all of the dungeons in base game Elden Ring just completely blended together, and often at the end you'd get like maybe an interesting boss, maybe, and like usually not an item worth all that trouble. In Shadow of the Erdtree, you get way fewer of those like boring copy paste tile dungeons, which I really appreciated, and the ones that you did get had more variety in like the traps and the enemies that you fight in there. So the Shadow of the Erdtree dungeons, I would argue, are just strictly better than base game Elden Ring ones. The boss fights, I'm going to reveal my casualness. In Dark Souls, I bothered to solo all the bosses, but in Elden Ring, I just don't bother. I could do it if I really, was willing to put in the effort and the time, but honestly, I've just enjoyed my game experience more when I use summon other players. Sometimes I will do a boss fight with like my Mimic tier and maybe like an NPC summon if they're available, but typically I just don't worry too much about it, and I go with, cooperative play to beat the harder bosses. And I think probably someday I'll go back to Elden Ring and just try and solo all the bosses, but that day is a long ways away. And I don't know, maybe it won't, maybe I won't get there. But anyway, that was probably more information that you needed. My point is that a lot of people complained that the boss fights were too hard or had too many visual effects going on to kind of see what was happening, or they just were too fast. Like the bosses have like these ridiculous multi-hit combos that you can hardly like get a stab in between them or heal or whatever. And I guess I don't really have an opinion on that. I mean, the games have always been challenging, and really if you're expecting to do them solo, then I would understand why you might be complaining that they're too unforgiving. But honestly, in my opinion, do you really need to do them solo? If you do, then good for you, But I think this game is meant to be played to some extent cooperatively. And yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot to be said for making the bosses really hard for the players who want that extra challenge and who want to try and do it solo. But if you just want the story and the experience of, going through the game, then you can just do summons and get through those boss fights no problem. So, yeah, that's my unpopular opinion there. Finally, lackluster ending. I would agree that I wanted more. I wanted more out of the Shadow of the Erdtree ending than just the 20-second little cutscene that we got after fighting Radahn. I actually really wanted more of a epilogue or something. But the truth is, I'm actually surprised that we got as much as we did with that little 20-second cutscene, because FromSoft has never really been interested in having a lot of epilogue material. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Shadow of the Erdtree. I think that the TLDR for me is that it got a lot of criticism, and I think a lot of that criticism was unwarranted. Not only because the expansion is actually quite good and fixes a lot of the problems of Elden Ring, but even to assume that a DLC will be better than the base game is, I think, kind of unfair, and missing the point of what a DLC is. So my official recommendation is you should get Shadow of the Erdtree. It's a great expansion. It's a lot of fun, and I think it's quite good. Like, genuinely a really good DLC. And I hope that the negative press that it got doesn't discourage FromSoft from continuing to make excellent content. So this kind of brings me to the second part of the video, which is what should Miyazaki do next? Let's kind of look here at this nice gentleman, Hidetaka Miyazaki. In case you're unfamiliar, this is the guy. This is the guy, Hidetaka Miyazaki. He designed. Oh yeah, there he is. He designed Dark Souls. He designed Demon Souls. He's, I guess, now the president of FromSoft. He designed Elden Ring, Bloodborne, all of the big, FromSoft games. And this man is an artist, really. Like, it's shocking to me how many successes he's had and how clear his vision for a game has remained after years and years of making games. Like, yeah, it's actually quite exceptional and unusual to find an artist who's reached this level of success and still remains so true to his work. So I have kind of a fan crush on Miyazaki, in case you can't tell. And this whole conversation about Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree kind of made me think about From Software games as a whole and what people want out of them and what maybe Miyazaki wants out of them. Because for context, Miyazaki recently said in an interview that he's going to keep making games, which I think is great. We need more Miyazaki games. He said that he was not completely satisfied. Actually, let me see if I can just find this. Miyazaki Shadow of the Erdtree interview. Okay, here it is, The Guardian. Okay, this is what I was thinking of, yeah. It is rare for From Software to make a sequel. Elden Ring will not be getting one. Shadow of the Erdtree is the end of the story. Whatever Miyazaki's next project is, it will be different. Has he made his dream game yet? Miyazaki says, let's just say for the record that I'm planning on making that game. I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that Miyazaki is going to continue making probably Souls games. And somewhere else in that interview, it says that he hasn't made his perfect game yet. He hasn't really done his he feels like he has not made his magnum opus, which is kind of mind-blowing if you think about it. I mean, Elden Ring was like one of the top grossing games of all time, and he's still not satisfied with it, which is, I mean, I really respect this guy's creative drive. So I was thinking, now that we've kind of talked about all of the stuff that was maybe not so great about Shadow of the Erdtree, and by extension not so great about Elden Ring itself, as Miyazaki is thinking about his next game, what would be a step up from Elden Ring? Like, what would be the next thing that is an improvement, that is better, that's more epic, that it just further hones his craft? So I put together a few things that are on my wish list for a next From Software game. So let's see. Fewer useless items. Man, I feel like we just talked about this. So let's take a look at some of the consumables in Elden Ring. The pots, you probably don't use these very often. Blessing of Marika, I mean, that's useful, but it's so rare that I just never really use it. Yeah, I guess my feelings are on kind of the items in From Software games in general. They kind of fall into three categories. The one category is like actual useful items that you want and that you'll use all the time. And this is a very small category. Obviously, your flask, your Estus flask or your Sacred flask or whatever is going to be in that. Your Flask of Wondrous Physic is something that you should use all the time. The rest, I don't know. I mean, the rest fall into the other two categories, which is something that is kind of... So some of these are so rare that I feel bad using them, like the Blessing of Marika, or like, I don't know, like Iris of Grace, that's a story item. I don't know, so some of these other ones are like, you can't really buy them, but they and they're so rare that even though they're meant to be used, I just never want to. Yeah, I mean, like the scorpion stew. Like, I don't think it says not craftable. Like, I would kind of feel bad using this because I can't imagine that I'd get a whole lot of use out of it. I'd probably use it on some boss fight and then get killed immediately later. And then I was like, well, that was my one scorpion stew for the run. Maybe that's just a me problem, but I think other people get this. The third category of item are items that they're very plentiful, but they're just not useful. Like you just never use them more than like once or twice in the whole game. Like all of these, like grease are like they're pretty useful. I honestly never use this pickled liver stuff, or really any of the buff stuff. Which maybe I should, like the cooked crab meat or whatever. I just find it tedious. Like you have to like go to a special place to buy them, and you have to have them equipped and stuff. And at a certain point, I just don't care enough to want to get all of these consumables and make sure I have a good supply of them. So, first item on my wish list. First item on my wish list is going to be fewer useless items. I feel this very strongly with weapons, and to a lesser extent armor, but the weapons in the game, there are so many, and like 95% of them are just not viable, at least in PvP. Maybe like 20% of the weapons are viable in just like doing normal run stuff, killing monsters and stuff. But I would say that a weapon that's good in PvP is generally good in the base game as well. And there's only a handful of weapons, like maybe 20 weapons or so, are actually like competitive in PvP. And those are the weapons that I tend to want to build around. Because if I'm going to spend all my time getting used to a weapon and like upgrading it and stuff, then I want it to be viable in case I get invaded or in case I want to do the Colosseum. Sekiro, I did this quite well, where you only have one weapon throughout all of Sekiro, and it's your sword. You do have some arm attachments that you can get funky with, but generally you just have one weapon throughout Sekiro. And I'm not suggesting that we go that extreme, but there's got to be like 100 weapons in Elden Ring, and there's got to be more than 100 weapons in Elden Ring, and the vast majority of them are just totally useless. Same with armor. Like, I have a kind of a weird opinion about armor, which is that there are a few directions that they could go with the armor, and they've got to pick a lane. If they want the armor to be chosen on an aesthetic value, then the armor should have no stats and just be picked purely aesthetically. And your defensive stats should come from somewhere else. I would be totally on board with this option. Another option is to make the armor actually realistically scale with your endurance. And what I mean by this is I think my current character has like 35 endurance or something, which means that he can wear like the heaviest armor in the game, or close to the heaviest armor in the game, and still not fat roll, which is just ridiculous. I mean, I think it's completely silly that characters in FromSoft games can increasingly wield like ginormous weapons and heavy, super dense armor and still like roll around like you're completely naked. That's kind of baked into the experience of the game at this point, but I honestly think that we should normalize making heavy armor give like significant advantages, but also just be a lot heavier, or reduce the threshold it takes before you start fat rolling, because it is just kind of tiresome how you can be extremely heavily armored and also extremely evasive in these games. It kind of takes away from the immersion of the game, which I think is a problem. Anyway, I probably talked too long about useless items. What's next on my wish list? Streamline it a bit better. Talk about Sekiro. I've already talked about Sekiro. The thing that I miss about Dark Souls is and I'm talking about Dark Souls 1 here, which I know is going back a bit too far. I mean, we're obviously not on that track anymore, but one of the things that was so special about Dark Souls is that the world was so compact and it kind of interlinked, and one area led kind of seamlessly into another area across the map, and like you could open a shortcut that took you across the map in a really surprising and delightful way. And Elden Ring does not have this. Elden Ring obviously is an open world game, and I have a lot of feelings about open world games because while they're super popular, and I can see why they're popular. I mean, it's nice to have a lot of space to explore. They tend to be a lot less curated than a more linear world. And so a common complaint that pops up when, in open world games is that there's just not enough to do, or that everything feels copy pasted. This was a big problem for me in Skyrim, was that almost all of the dungeons felt exactly the same. They used the same tile set, same few enemies. Super tedious. Elden Ring falls into this trap a bit. Not terribly, but when you compare it to a game like Dark Souls, where every location is kind of lovingly crafted and has a lot of story kind of packed into it, by comparison, Elden Ring just looks really sparse. Even though they do a pretty good job of making sure that their open world has stuff in it to interact with, the environmental storytelling is like really turned down because there's just so much more environment that you can't pack as much story into, that there's more space to put the story, and so it's less dense, and so it feels less lived in. I think that the open world style suits Elden Ring, but I think that it took away from the curated experience that makes FromSoft games so special and lets FromSoft games tell a really compelling story. And so while I would love to get another FromSoft game that's as big as Elden Ring, I would much rather get a game that's smaller in scope but has more attention to detail, I guess. Even if that means making it a little more linear. Again, that's probably an unpopular opinion, but that's exactly what I just talked about. I'd prefer a smaller, denser map. So long as the map is dense, it doesn't matter how big it is, but I would much rather have a dense map than a big map. Horses, maybe. I'm not quite sure why they felt the need to add horses to a FromSoft game. I guess probably because it was new and sexy, and I wouldn't hate it if they added horse riding again to their next game, but I just hope that they don't use horses as a reason to make the game more spread out. Like, I think the existence of horse riding in this game it encourages players to move fast through the world, when what I want is for players to move, as a player, I want to move slower through the world and really, kind of explore every nook and cranny more, and get more texture from the world that I do pass through, instead of just kind of moving faster through a bigger space that's emptier. The last thing I wanted to talk about, this is the last thing, is leaning into the lore. I think something we can all agree on is that the story is what makes FromSoft games special. I mean, the gameplay is excellent, the settings are excellent and stuff, but it's all kind of about the story for me, which is weird to say and to realize because the story plays such a small part in the kind of regular gameplay loop of Elden Ring and Dark Souls and other FromSoft games. But the story kind of gives meaning to all of it, and gives context to all of it, and gives me a reason to explore. I mean, when I'm kind of progressing through the game and I'm hustling to get to the final boss, it's not because I want to get a cool sword or something, or even because I necessarily am looking forward to getting my butt kicked or kicking the butt of a boss. It's because I want to see what impact that has and what implications that has on the story. And just being able to read the item descriptions and enjoy the texture of the world and make small connections on my own, and then watch like a Vati video later, and have the lore kind of further explained to me, so I can kind of make those connections and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That just adds so much to the experience for me. And I think it does for a lot of From Software's kind of diehard fans. And this is going to, I don't think I've heard other people say this, but in my opinion, From Software could lean way harder into the lore for their games, and fans would still be on board. I don't mean making the lore more clear, I mean making more of it. Like having, more important locations, more NPCs that you can talk to. Honestly, I think this would actually be a huge improvement to their style, is if they had more NPCs you could talk to. Even if they don't have like huge quest lines in themselves, just adding that would add so much texture to the world and add so much opportunity to give detail and background and context for why the events of the game are happening. In general, another way of putting this is that I think in general, a particular From Software game, Vati Vidya, if you don't watch his videos, you totally should. I do. I watch every video he puts out. Whenever a From Software game comes out, the lore can usually be summed up in, I don't know, like maybe 10 of his videos, depending on how granular he wants to get. I want to have a game where it takes 20 videos to kind of unshuffle things. Like I want a Pantheon, like I want an Elden Ring Pantheon, but with twice the number of characters. Yes, I know it would be impossible to remember which M name refers to which character, but honestly, that's a challenge that I'm ready to accept, because I just want to dive even deeper into a world made by Miyazaki. And currently the depth that they're going with their current lore is just not cutting it for me. Not as a bad thing, it's just, I think that's a good thing, right? Leave them wanting more. Well, I officially wish that there was more lore to Elden Ring. I wish there was twice as much lore. And that's something that I think was totally possible. The fans would be on board. It wouldn't detract from the gameplay. It would just give people more to dive into if they wanted more of the story aspect of these excellent games. That, I guess, my last little quibble is probably just slower movement. I know this is kind of a funny way to follow up the lore point, but I think we've all kind of noticed that From Software games have been just getting faster and faster in terms of like the speed with which you need to react and the speed with which your character reacts to your inputs. And I'm not quite sure why they chose to go with this direction, besides to make it more of an action game, I guess. When I go back to play Dark Souls, which I do every so often, it's striking just how much slower the Dark Souls 1 character is. I mean, if you put on heavy armor, you feel it. Like you're kind of, you're not slow. You're just rolling is less of what you want to do, and blocking is more viable. Whereas with like basically since Dark Souls 3 and up, it's all about dodging. I mean, blocking is just not really what you want to be doing unless you're facing a boss with like huge area of effect attacks. And I don't think that it would make a From Software game less tense if the game was slower paced. I think you would just make it more tactical, because when your character moves slower, it's less about reaction time and it's more about planning out how you're going to approach an encounter or a combat, which feels just as engaging. It's just a little more thinky, I guess, and a little less like knee-jerk, oh, I gotta dodge now sort of thing. This is purely personal preference. I'm totally fine with the fast and furious kind of dodge-based combat, but I think I generally prefer the slower combat, because I think in a weird way it's more accessible, because it's more tactical and less based on reaction speed. And I think it also is more immersive, because, I mean, let's be honest, like, when are you going to see a knight in full plate armor dodging when they could just block, I think dodging is a great mechanic, but I don't think it should be viable unless you're, like, actually just wearing clothes, or like a mage or something. Anyway, that's probably all I can think of for my long Shadow of the Erdtree ramble. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any thoughts in the comments. Yeah, let's just try and stay positive about Shadow of the Erdtree, because honestly, it was quite a good DLC. I don't understand the bad rap that people give it, and we need more From Software games. Anyway, thanks for watching, and have a great day.